arachnoid mater, which means spider mother, and then directly attached to the brain is what's called the pia mater, or delicate mother. So here, this connective tissue, this tough connective tissue you see around it, that is the dura mater, which means tough mother. Inflammation of these meninges is called meningitis. That's what meningitis is. So we're going to cut away this meninges. So the outermost one is called the dura mater. Here you can still see remnants of the optic nerve. So this is the optic nerve right here. So right here would have been the eyeballs, and then the nerve that goes from the eye to the brain, it's right here, it's called the optic nerve. We're going to learn more about those nerves here on Tuesday. You guys are just waiting for it to get on.
What is that lining you're cutting called?
It's called the dura mater.
The dura?
Dura mater, which means tough mother in Latin.
Mater?
Yeah, dura mater.
Mater.
Mater, M-A-T-E-R. So mater means mother in Latin. So for example, your mom's parents are your maternal grandparents. Pater is Latin for father. Your dad's parents are your paternal grandparents. America is a paternal society. We pass, right, you inherit your father's name, whereas in Latin America you inherit both your mother and your father's name, so you end up with two last names.
So with like a subdural hematoma, you'd be bleeding below that dura mater?
Correct, yeah. So you can have a dural hematoma, and then you can have a subdural, and then you also have the epidural. Okay? So epidural is the space between the dura mater and the brain, or and the spinal cord. We oftentimes will inject medication into the epidural space, but sometimes we will direct it into the subarachnoid space here. So let me take this off here. If you look here on the inside of it, so the outside is the dura mater, the tough mother. Directly on the inside, you can see these really faint little, looks like spider veins. That's the arachnoid mater, which is why we call it the spider mother. And then if you look here at the brain, see how the brain's kind of shiny? That is the pia mater, which is attached directly to the brain. So you can actually peel off that shiny pia mater. If I had my tweezers here, I don't have my tweezers here. So that's the pia mater that you see right there. Your brain secretes cerebral spinal fluid. Your brain and your spine has cerebral spinal fluid. That's produced by epididymal cells that are located between the dura mater and the arachnoid, or just below the arachnoid mater. That's where the cerebral spinal fluid is produced. So the brain is free floating in the skull, at least for humans. Other brains aren't free floating. Like for example, bighorn sheep. Bighorn sheep's brain is directly attached to the skull, doesn't move at all. So bighorn sheep can, bash their heads together. Mm-hmm. Our brains are free floating. What's the clinical significance of that? What happens when we have blunt force trauma to the head? So when we slam our head against something, the brain's going to rattle around inside of the brain case. So that's going to cause additional trauma because it's just going to rattle around. That's why repeated blows to the head can cause significant brain trauma. That's what concussion is, right? So you get hit in the head rattles around, and that kind of shorts out the lights for a little bit, right? You you get knocked unconscious, or concussion. You can also have subconcussive blows, and that can cause cumulative trauma, and we call that CTE. That's what all the football players keep getting. That's called chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Right? So that's brain damage that's of a cumulative nature. It takes years to get in there. Now, there's a couple differences between a human brain and a sheep's brain. Sheep are quadrupeds, right? So they're like this, whereas humans are up like this. So their brain stem goes back as opposed to being underneath like our brain is. Okay? But you have all of the same lobes that we do. You got a frontal lobe, temporal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe. Here is the cerebellum, and then here is the brainstem, and then tucked up underneath is the insular lobe. Here you can see this is what's left of the olfactory nerve. Olfactory nerve is smell. Then that was the optic nerve we saw here. This here is called the optic chiasma. Most of what your right eye sees is processed by your left hemisphere. Most of what your left eye sees is processed by your right hemisphere. When I use my left hand, my right hemisphere is controlling it and vice versa. So that is where that happens right there, is in the optic chiasm, at least where the vision goes. Okay. All right, so let's cut this right down the center. You can see the brain is hemispherical. Here you see this large white thing right here. This large white thing right here, this is called the corpus callosum, which means white body. The corpus callosum is a large chunk of myelinated tissue. This connects the two hemispheres of the brain. This allows the right hemisphere to talk to the left hemisphere and vice versa. In somebody with severe epilepsy or Parkinson's, like Michael J. Fox, oftentimes we will do a procedure to cut the corpus callosum so that the two halves of the brain can't talk to each other anymore. This can reduce symptoms between the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. This will temporarily cause impairment in function, but the brain will learn how to cope with not being able to communicate with the two sides of the brain. Here you can see the thalamus. So here, this big thing here, so this is the thalamus. Right below it is the hypothalamus. Again, hypothalamus is where we control all of our drives like hunger, thirst, things like that. Also where we regulate temperature. The thalamus, again, is the central relay station. All of the incoming sensory information except for smell first goes to the thalamus. And then from the thalamus, it goes to the appropriate association area in the brain. Okay? Here is, again, the cerebellum. The function of the cerebellum is to help coordinate movement. With damage to the cerebellum, you're going to be a little clumsy. See this white tissue in the center? This white tissue in the center, this myelinated tract in the center, is known as the arbor vitae. Arbor vitae means tree of life. You guys heard of Arbor Day? What do we do on Arbor Day? We plant trees. So arbor means tree. So that's called the arbor vitae. Here you can see the pons and the medulla oblongata, and then here is the beginning of the brainstem. The pons and the medulla oblongata regulate heart and the lungs. Any even minute damage to either the pons or the medulla oblongata is going to cause nearly instantaneous death. For example, snipers. Snipers are trained to shoot at the base of the skull. That's where the brainstem is. If you shoot through the base of the skull, the bullet's going to go immediately through the brainstem, and it's going to cause instantaneous lights out. Right? So they're not going to be able to do anything at that point. So any even slight damage to the brainstem is going to cause permanent damage. Who was talking about Phineas Gage? So there's all things here. Here at the bottom here, these are called the cerebral peduncles. Right? They mean little feet. And here is the superior and inferior colliculi. We also have ventricles. Ventricles is where the cerebral spinal fluid is made. And between here, we have what are called the lateral ventricles. Okay. If I were to cut this open here, see how it's different colored, right? So there's some pink stuff going on in here.
Oh my gosh.
Sorry about that.
No.
Close my mouth.
Okay. Can we? I had that happen to me one time. A piece went flying right in my mouth. So see how it's faintly pink here. Right? So that is the choroid plexus. That's what actually produces the cerebral spinal fluid. So you got the two lateral ventricles. Then you have what's called the third ventricle, which is right here. This is called the cerebral aqueduct, and then here is the fourth ventricle. Okay, so it goes down the brain through the spinal cord, gets to the bottom of the spinal cord. There's a hole in the spinal cord called the central canal, and then it goes back up through the spinal cord. Right, so the cerebral spinal fluid is constantly circulating. Now, normally, right, so you're having a kid and you decide you're going to do a natural birth. We will then insert the needle through the dura mater into the subarachnoid space. Now we're delivering the drug into the cerebral spinal fluid, but we're